Datacentric. The mentors and volunteers are all from Peace Studies. Bennett, who was leading them vocally, is just graduating in Peace Studies. And we have hosted Peace Jam, which is an international project, since 2006. And we are continuing to do so, taking into schools, taking into youth groups. So this is the future of peace studies and peace activism. Today with the young people, which is an immense privilege. So we'll leave you with another burst of noise. Thank you very much.
Final session, and there are three of us on the panel. With Tom Woodhouse, I think now technically a Professor Emeritus and not on the payroll. I'm afraid I'm the oldest lag to survive here, and I'm still just here, at least in a part-time basis. One of the newest lags, of course, is Caroline, who's done such a tremendous job on the conference. And Jenny's been here as sort of the middle time. I'd never even dare use the term lag in her because she never stands still, but perhaps call her the honey in the sandwich between the two of us. I will go first with some introductory remarks, and then Jenny will follow with, I think, some reflections just on the subject as a whole, but also how the conference has developed, including the sessions we had earlier today. And Caroline will finish. Having worked in Australia for the last 6 years, I think Caroline will be able to give a kind of external view, having been in peace studies for the best part of a year, a kind of outside view of maybe what it looked like and what it may or may not become. But let me start just, I suppose, almost going down to basics, and it's worth actually remembering what we think and hope that peace studies is about at Bradford, and perhaps more generally. About 8 to 10 years ago, the university, in its universal wisdom as universities do, had the desperate need for a mission statement. And ours became making knowledge work. And of course, individual departments were required to have mission statements. My favorite, and I can't remember exactly which verse it is, I think it's Isaiah book 2, chapter 6, which is the one about studying war no more. And in a single phrase, it's studying war no more, swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. I've actually got an illuminated version of it in my room. But we had to have an official mission statement, and we came up with this, which we still use. It's a bit complex, but it's good. We combine empirical, theoretical, and applied research with sustained engagement at international, regional, national, and local levels to analyze, prevent, and resolve conflicts and develop peaceful societies. We aim for an enabling environment for international research and excellence involving diverse and critical approaches. That's what we try to do, and I think it's probably a reasonable indicator, maybe for peace research as a whole. A few years ago, Oliver Ransbottom and I did a paper for political studies, which was looking at the development of peace research. And Oliver actually explored what he thought from his perspective, and he was head of department at the time, were the features that combined to illustrate what peace studies was about. And it's useful just to go back to them, because in some ways it delineates, if you like, the specificity of what we're about. In some ways maybe distinguishes it from some of the other more traditional disciplines. And he lists 7 different areas. I'll touch on them very briefly. One is always the concern with underlying causes, going on beyond the immediate symptoms to get at the roots of the causes of conflicts, whether that is virtually from the community right through to the international. It is necessarily and advisedly interdisciplinary, or more, as Jenny often uses the term, transdisciplinary. And I think this is something which people tend to forget. We have staff and students here from just about every branch of study. Obviously, the concentration is on the social sciences, but I mean, Owen was originally a physicist. My PhD was in microbiology. What was it? The ecology, the microbial ecology of soil-borne plant pathogens. And if you want to study the ecology of soil organisms in one thumbful of soil, you actually have a whole world. And how I got into the piece is a completely different matter. Oliver himself had degrees in maths. Malcolm Dando was a neurophysiologist. We have labour historians, anthropologists, social psychologists, political scientists, economists, international relations people have been involved in the department. And it is intentionally and always interdisciplinary. Non-violent transformation, that's almost at the root of it. Peace studies isn't pacifist. In fact, there was one historical period when war studies had 2 pacifists on the staff and we only had 1. So it's not pacifist as such, but it always leans in the direction of non-violent change, a point that was made earlier on. It is multi-level, necessarily, from the community right through to the global. And I think this, to be candid, was something of a fault of the department until maybe 15 years ago. I think, Sarah, you'd probably agree with this, that it's only in the last 15 years, and not least thanks to Jenny and her team, we've actually been much more involved at the full spectrum. And that, I think, has added to a strength of our own learning experience. It is, I think, though, still global in the sense that it tries, usually fails, but tries to avoid Western ethnocentricity. It's not very successful in that, but we recognize the need for that the whole time. We're helped hugely by the range of people who come particularly to study here. I have to say it's very daunting to do an introductory lecture for the MA class where you may have 70 students from 30 countries, and anything you talk about, somebody in the room will know a lot more about it than you. It's quite good for the humility side, but it can be really quite daunting at times, even if in many ways very inspiring. It is analytical and normative at the same time very much, and it is really always trying to link theory and practice. Now, I think if you put those together, it does distinguish peace studies and peace research from other areas. How successful it is, though, I think is very debatable, and this is what I really want to touch on finally. Tom earlier this afternoon, Tom Woodhouse, was talking about, in a sense, speaking up for peace studies, and he's absolutely right to do so. There's far more of it about, but there's far more of it, probably not much more of it, in what you might call the global north, and I will include Australia in that. I was talking to Wendy earlier on this afternoon, and essentially the real development of peace studies has been across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent the Middle East and South Asia and Southeast Asia. That's where the growth has been. And if we are addressing many of the causes which reside in the north, then the critiques applied to the north essentially are still largely, I have to say, I think, wanting. I had the dubious privilege of being vice chair and then chair of the Learned Society, the British International Studies Association, a few years ago. And as vice chair, you were the program person for the conference. And I must admit, I remember late at night going through yet another set of papers and thinking, if I get one more paper about the English school, I will scream. And the problem was that so much of it I found and still find is actually very inward-looking. And I think this is a problem. If you look across the British university system, the places on the critical security side that are doing the really independent work are pretty few and far between. I would single out Manchester in particular. I think the Global Uncertainties group at Bristol, the Conflict and Security group at Sussex, and the group that Mark Fithian is assembling with Tara McCormack and Ben Zala and others at Leicester. They're all very interesting groups. But that is in, you know, a national provision of international studies, which I think is actually very weak in critical independent scrutiny. And I think that is one area which really persists and we have to address. Now, why do we have to address it? What are the future challenges? 2 quick anecdotes. When I first came up here, before the M1 extension was built around Leeds, if you wanted to go through to York, you used to go on the old A642. Took you past Garforth and then through rolling country up to Tadcaster. At one little point near the village of Towton, you go through open country, and I noticed a sort of white sort of cross, it wasn't actually a cross, a kind of marker just by the roadside next to a stretch of holly bush. And I stopped the car, and all it said on it was 1461. And I looked into the detail, there was nothing more about it. There are a series of panels which explain it. And that was the site of the Battle of Towton. And the Battle of Towton was the climactic battle of a huge civil war in medieval England, the Wars of the Roses. The roses, the houses of York White Rose and Lancaster Red Rose. And on that day in Towton, Palm Sunday, 1461, 28,000 people died on the battlefield. That was 1 in 30 of the entire adult population of England, a male population of England. It was almost all men, and the women, of course, suffered hugely as a result of the total destruction of that. It wasn't the last battle of the Civil War, the Wars of the Roses, that was Bosworth Field, 1485, made famous by Shakespeare's play Richard III. But that was the level of violence, and in a sense, I think you always need that perspective. Again, it was said earlier today, in some ways, we're experiencing relatively more peace. But that doesn't mean that we don't have huge problems ahead. So the second anecdote, very briefly, is that last year, almost exactly this time last year, I had an email out of the blue from somebody at the Changing Character of War group at Oxford University. He said, would you come down and lead off on a seminar on the future problem of failed and failing states? We have a number of specialists going to speak on it, but we want somebody to sort of set the scene. I was doing quite a lot of work on the impact of climate change at the time. I said, yeah, very interesting. He said, we'll put you out at Wadham for a couple of nights. I said, well, what's the group? He said, well, I'd rather not say now, but you'll find them very interesting. So I thought maybe it's sort of maybe a government department or something. It sounds interesting, and 2 days in Wadham College in July sounded attractive, so I fell for it. And I went down and spoke to him and a couple of the others in the pub the night before. It turned out this was 30 people, the commandant and all the senior officer corps of the SAS, plus Special Boat Squadron, plus MI6, plus people from Defence Intelligence Staff. And what they were interested in was looking ahead at where they would be working to make secure Britain's overseas interests. They were looking 5 to 10 years ahead. And in a sense, I think it's the marker for the kind of military thinking that's going on. I would suggest that we're moving into a period of huge change, and it's a period where I think, in fact, peace studies is going to be required to respond to an immense challenge. I would actually disagree very much with David Chandler. I think the need is going to be far more urgent in the next 10 or 20 years. Because what is becoming absolutely clear is that there are two huge global trends that are happening now, not in the future. We're now seeing the demonstrable failure of the open market capitalist system. Now that is being subject to serious analysis. I know people in peace studies and elsewhere have been arguing this for a decade or two. And it is leading to incredible divisions and a huge amount of resentment, not least because of the extraordinary improvements in education of the last 40 years. People are far more aware of their own marginalization. A lot of it underpins the anger which lay behind the Arab awakening. If you look at some of the major radical social movements, like, for example, the Naxals, the neo-Maoist Naxals in India, you have something happening there which is happening now. And the other great trend which is happening now is climate disruption. At that particular conference, the second speaker was a very well-informed analyst from Islamic Relief. That's based in Birmingham. It's a large NGO, raises £100 million a year. And she was saying, she responded to my comments about climate change. She said that the one message they're getting from their field agents, and they work particularly in semi-arid countries, is the impact now of climate disruption. And this is really coming. So we're moving into an era of a socioeconomically divided world which is also constrained. It's the anthropogenic impact on entire global ecosystem homeostasis. And we're moving into a very different era, but the key thing is this is not in the future. What is now clear, has become clear in the last 5 years, it is happening now, and it is accelerating. And it seems to me that it's going to be critically important to do the kind of work that is going to ensure that the changes happen soon enough so that we don't actually have catastrophic change at the last minute. Which is why I think that there's a huge challenge ahead, particularly for groups such as ourselves, and I'm speaking about all of us, who are actually concerned with these issues and trying to think through to the future and trying to think in an interdisciplinary and openly normative way. If we can do that, then I think we have a role which is probably going to be even more important than peace research served at the height of the Cold War. But it's a huge challenge, and frankly, I don't know whether we're up to it. If we're not, then I think it's extremely dangerous. If we are, then I think, in sense, the kind of work that is done here by so many of you is going to be far more important in the next 10 or 20 years than it's been in the last 10 or 20 years. Now, let me say that by way of introduction. I'll pass straight on to Jenny to talk through this in particular, maybe more specifically in relation to peace studies.
Okay, well, I had to rethink some of the things I was going to say in the light of the very provocative and very constructively and positively so panel that we had earlier. I kept my title, which I'd also invented a word, and then I heard Jean-Paul invented one this morning, so I thought, well, if he can, I will definitely keep my invented one. And mine's The Perplexities of Peace Studies. And I looked up to see whether actually perhaps it is a proper word of some kind. And perplexity in the archaic means entangled state. So I thought that was quite good, actually, because I like the word entanglement, because it has a sense of the kind of the messiness of the real world. It actually is a word that came up in that panel quite a lot. But I think it's a challenge as well to peace studies when peace studies is or purports to disentangle. You know, are we disentangling? To what extent are we offering something in that sense of disentangling? Well, I was particularly kind of wanting to respond to David's challenges, and I'm not going to respond to all of them throughout what I'm going to say, but I think one or two things that he said really sparked something off that was important. I don't really personally recognise the idea that there's a peace telos. And for me, I think a relational ontology was precisely what Adam Curl always argued peace studies was all about. However, I think what David was warning us about, which is important, is the idea of grandiosity. The idea that somehow peace studies can change all the problems of the world or has solutions to them, and that alone peace studies offers something that other disciplines don't. But actually, I look back over some of the things that Adam Curl was writing, and he was very, very aware of this challenge. He said, the first step is to use the word peace with caution. It is both too emotive and too vague, and most of us do a mental genuflection before it without defining it. I prefer to speak of peaceful or unpeaceful relationships. Relational ontology. These phrases imply a system of interaction to be analysed. And his successor, James O'Connell, he also talked about the problem in peace studies of it kind of depending on a cocoon of moralism. So I think that there is something here that David was trying to get at, but I also think this has been a concern within peace studies for some time. But I think what has happened over the years is that the issue of grandiosity doesn't necessarily come from us. It comes from a world out there which is looking for something, which is offering a way forward to all the many issues that Paul referred to and that we face today. It's that sense that if we didn't have the word peace, we'd have to invent it. We need a word like this, a word that would actually encompass this big umbrella of issues that we're facing, and that gives us a sort of ideal of something we would like to move towards in the future. And I think many of us pick up on that, many of the staff, in terms of the kind of students that come to peace studies, the special nature of our student cohort, which continues to be the case. But to have a place which claims to study peace raises a set of expectations, really very high, I think. And I think with the growth and success of peace studies, which happened really very much in the 1990s, and I think it's correct, some of the things that were said in the previous panel to draw attention to the fact that in the post-Cold War, our growth was such that a realization of the level of post-Cold War conflictivity and violence perhaps didn't enable us to kind of respond in the theoretical, conceptual way we might have wanted to. And we rapidly became something which I think risked us becoming a brand. And it's the demand created that brand, if you like. And for me, it makes me think, well, what ultimately is our purpose? And for me, the purpose is about exceptionalizing to normalize. That is, in a way, the way Tom Woodhouse talked about, to exceptionalize in order to influence, in order to build a wider and wider constituency of people that are concerned about what peace is. It isn't to normalize in order to exceptionalize. So it's not, in other words, to become mainstream and normal in order, therefore, to keep up this brand. So for me, I think that this issue of grandiosity is important, but for me, I think it comes outside of peace studies, not so much from within peace studies. But I want to defend the potentiality that there is in peace studies for realizing some kind of exceptionality that can influence. And as a political scientist, for me, studying peace is not about substituting my discipline, but it's an opportunity to learn from other disciplines and to break down those disciplinary barriers. As Paul says, I sometimes talk about transdisciplinarity. For me, that's very important because normal science offers barriers to the kinds of questions that we're trying to respond to in peace studies. Actually, peace studies cannot be, or peace cannot be looked at from one disciplinary lens. We absolutely have to communicate with each other across the disciplines. But I think it's precisely this possibility of interdisciplinary conversations that has proved difficult in peace studies. And I think there are various reasons for that. I think partly it's the institutional dynamics of academia that make these sorts of boundary-crossing conversations so very difficult. And it's partly because it's extremely difficult when we're trained in defending ourselves from a certain kind of disciplinary worldview to actually acknowledge that maybe that discipline does not give the answers, but not only does it not give the answers, actually by only wanting to talk within your disciplinary framework, you're perpetuating the problem, because I cannot, from my perspective as a political scientist, understand everything, for instance, about the reproduction of violences. For me, being in peace studies has enabled me to focus on a whole range of new areas of study that help me to respond to the question that really motivates me a lot to respond to, which is how do we build the conditions to live without violence? And in fact, neuroscience and biology, these for me are fields totally outside my area of expertise, but peace studies has encouraged me to go to conferences and struggle with a language I don't really understand very well, but it's given me huge insights in order to understand how violence is reproduced and its multi-level and multivariable character. So, but if we are to exceptionalize in order to normalize, in order to extend the influence of the ideas of peace and etc., peace studies definitely needs to do a lot of serious work. And I think the problem we face is that it was very interesting, Hillary's question in the panel. I loved her question, which is when peace studies was set up, it was set up to transform the university. And I think we have to acknowledge that peace studies was unable to do that, but also, if it had, can you imagine a university which actually was, in all its disciplinary areas, focused on trying to build debates, dialogue, critical engagement with social reality for change, putting the idea of non-violence on the agenda. For me, that would have been a fantastic opportunity. It's one I still aspire to, actually. Sometimes they call me Doña Quixote, but there is, for me, a real challenge in trying to do that. What some of us have done is to try and build a community university, the idea of which is to recognise the knowledges outside this institution in order to see how those knowledges could then impact on the institution itself and on our understanding of where knowledge comes from, because my experience is that knowledge always comes from the ground. As a political scientist who works like an anthropologist, that's where I learn. And so for me, that idea is extremely important to try and build. But what we're facing at the moment, I think, is peace studies trying to extend itself, its influence, etc., firstly, from a basis of many challenges of this interdisciplinarity, these conversations, but also in a world where actually we're seeing so many challenges to any kind of communities that can be built that would actually encourage those kinds of cooperative endeavours, and where there's a declining interest in politics and a gap between the people who speak in the political arena and the people who no longer feel represented. And we are seeing huge challenges everywhere, I feel, around this issue. And it is not surprising to me that peace studies is also part of a context in which there's so much that is changing. And I think that came out very strongly in the panel earlier, which is how do we bring ourselves closer to the world that's changing around us, and how do we both interpret it and relate to it in a way that actually builds something we might call peace. Well as being a world, a very difficult and challenging world, I think it's also a world of opportunity. So Bauman wrote a really interesting piece called The Times of Disengagement, which was about how after the Cold War, the state, from having constructed our subjectivities for several centuries and subjected us, as Foucault has written about, to sort of governmentality, how the state after the Cold War has begun to disengage, and how that has given space, therefore, for new forms of activism and thinking at the ground level, and to new ideas that have come precisely from people who on the margins. I mean, I'm a firm believer that a lot of change comes from the margins. It's liminal, and it's in those spaces that people who have not been absorbed into the mainstream innovate, experiment, come out with new ideas and new perspectives. So for me, it's our connection with that world that really matters. That, for me, is where the future of peace studies lies. Our reconnection with the world outside the state, of action for change, of innovation, of participation. But I don't say that in a sort of easy way. I don't think that somehow or other out there waiting for us is the new ideas of what a peace would be in the future. I think it has to be engaged with, and I think academics have things to offer. And particularly, I think academics who are driven by norms and are driven by ideas that actually change really matters, and we could engage with people in ways that actually would help those processes of change, not simply extract data and information, publish them in the journals that help our careers, but actually we can give back something of what we learn from people by working with people. And I was thinking about what Jean-Paul Lederac said about not thinking about the state. Well, there's dangers in that. People need states. They need states that deliver good services, and they need states that actually help to rebalance power. There's all sorts of reasons why we need a certain kind of state. But I also think that there's something in that issue of, well, what now is happening outside the state that we can engage with? And I was thinking of Tahrir Square, where nonviolence played such a role in that public space, initiatives to really bring down that dictatorship, successfully brought down the dictatorship, but didn't have a vision of what would happen next. And in the vacuum, what have we seen? We've seen, first of all, we've seen the Muslim Brotherhood come back in, but then we've had what I personally would call a coup. The West refused to call it a coup, but we've now got a military government in Egypt. And so for me, how do academics relate to people on the ground like that? Aren't there ways in which we realise that it is important to dream about the future, that we have got lots of learning that has to be systematised? Can we work with people on the ground to help build with them? Because there are many intellectuals out in those movements, but I think we could at least support those sorts of change processes. So for me, yes, we do need to rebuild, perhaps, and strengthen the relational ontology, what I've sometimes called a horizontal ontology. It's a huge task, and it's a huge task in a world where actually there's so much in our institutions that is now so neoliberalized. We perhaps ourselves haven't realized the extent to which we are neoliberalized in academia. There's so much space we need to build to challenge the kind of processes that are subjecting us to market forces without our even being aware that that is going on, and changing the way we see the world, turning us into consumers, making us ask questions differently to what we would have asked in the past, forcing us to disengage rather to re-engage. So it seems to me there's a real challenge for us as individual academics as well as part of peace studies to do that. I do think that the panel, some of the people on the panel were right in saying that peace studies has not evolved enough in its ideas, in its theoretical and its conceptualizations. We still talk negative, positive peace. We still have tensions between therapeutic and structural transformation, between people who are interested in process and people who are interested in techniques. I think that's not just peace studies. I think there's a crisis, generally speaking, of the left and of progressive forces everywhere in trying to, because precisely I think the last decades there has been a disconnect with people on the ground. So for me, it's not just us that's facing that crisis, but I definitely think we have the responsibility, if we want to be at least attuned with the kinds of values we purport to espouse, to begin to reconnect. And on that basis, I just want to finish off with a few sort of, ideas of what the future might be. And I think we have to think about our internal and our external facing challenges as a department. And internally, I think with this interdisciplinarity, if we're going to build it, requires a lot of us to pay a cost of finding time. I say it's a cost because it's so difficult to find time, even to have a cup of coffee with a colleague, right? But to find time to rebuild those interdisciplinary conversations and the capacity to have those kinds of conversations, which isn't easy at the best of times, but I think we have to try and find it. I think we have to re-engage with activism and with practitioners. I know Owen always agrees with me when he says actually the world of practice is ahead of the academic world so often. But I also was aware on Friday night, someone challenged Tom Woodhouse, well, where are the women in the football team? That came from, an activist trying to kind of question what was going on. Actually, there was a women's football team, right? Bets Featherston, as well as winning a very important teaching innovation prize, she also actually was building a women's football team. So actually, we do have that, but we need those challenges, right, from activists and practitioners to help us to change. It was a great challenge, I think the ladies there, who stood up and said, well, she's against militarism. Our aim should be to be against militarism of all kinds. Well, these are the challenges that peace studies need. So we need to have relational ontologies, not only with other departments and other disciplines, but also with the communities around us at various levels and activists in different levels. And I think at the end we have to we've always said we're a normative department. We take for granted those norms. They have to be, there's no moral imperative around peace studies or one moral view. What there should be is an ongoing, continuously refreshed debate about what are the norms, and we need to do that with new colleagues who come in, and I think we need to build that process of discussion. And at the end of the day, and I'll finish on this, I think, for me, being in peace studies reminds me that I'm not just an academic, I'm also a citizen. And that, for me, makes us exceptional. And that's the kind of exceptionality I hope that we could develop in order to influence the world around us.
Thanks so much, Jenny. My notes at the back.
Well, thanks very much. I sort of feel a little bit at a disadvantage being the last person to speak in the conference. It's kind of hard to think of anything that hasn't already been said. But I think I'd like to just add a few words to what my colleagues have said. I'm very new in peace studies, and I have to say that I was a bit surprised when I arrived in peace studies last summer to see that there is this sort of, to some extent, kind of existential angst about the nature of peace studies, because to me, peace studies at Bradford always seemed to be a very solid, very important, very a beacon, if you like, a place that you could count on to be doing the right thing and to be saying interesting things and to be a repository of a lot of really interesting work about peace and conflict issues, because that's how I had always seen the department from the outside, and I'm certainly very proud now to be a member of staff in the department. But having sort of come into the department and looking at the issues that we face, and as a political economist, I tend to see the sort of issues that we face as a discipline as being very much related to things that are going on in the world outside. And I thought perhaps I'd make a few comments about that and how that sort of relates to my sort of personal experience. Now, a number of people have said, Jenny's just said that peace studies really had a big sort of surge in the 1990s. The end of the Cold War created huge interest in peace studies at the same time as we saw, the rise of critical theory in international relations. A very exciting, very productive time in those areas. My personal career at that time was in a area studies outfit. I was doing my PhD at the Centre for Southeast Asian Studies over in the University of Hull, which in the beginning of the 1990s was a very, very successful operation. It was the second largest centre for studying Southeast Asia outside of SOAS in the UK. We had a very highly regarded 4-year undergraduate programme where students learnt Indonesian and Thai and went off and spent a year in Southeast Asia and so on, and it was a fabulous place to work. In 1997, Southeast Asia, after a couple of decades of massive economic boom, huge economic growth, the emergence of countries like Singapore going from absolute poverty to developed country status, in 1997 that all sort of came to a crashing halt with the Asian financial crisis. 4 or 5 of the largest, most successfully growing economies in East Asia crashed horribly, throwing tens of millions of people into poverty. And as researchers, we all sort of jumped on planes and shot over to Southeast Asia thinking, what's going on here? The causes and the implications of this are going to keep us busy for years. But interestingly, the following year, after the Asian financial crisis, the Centre for Southeast Asian Studies at Hull went from recruiting 25 to 30 very good undergraduate students a year to recruiting, I think, 2. The interest in Southeast Asia evaporated along with the money, apparently, and I found that a very interesting phenomenon. And it was a phenomenon that's reflected more widely in the real collapse of area studies in the 1990s. And that's something that I think sort of forms a background to my sort of perspective on this debate about peace studies and where it might be going. Area studies, I think, became very unfashionable after the Cold War because there was a new liberal triumphalism, the idea that universal principles can work, that the world isn't divided into very different areas. Fundamentally, we're all the same. Liberalism is going to work. Liberalism is going to solve problems. And because of that, people stopped being interested in going to the sort of ground level and seeing what was happening and talking to people and listening to people. And the study of foreign languages collapsed in this country and in the United States. The study of Asian languages collapsed and has never recovered, apart from possibly Chinese. And I think that was a really unfortunate phenomenon. So I think that sort of consolidation, if you like, or the march of liberalism in the 1990s, at the same time as it maybe gave some sort of a boost to peace studies in some ways, but was disastrous for area studies and prompted a real loss of expertise, a loss of infrastructure that we could have been building on. Now, of course, to some extent, area studies, I think, was built on slightly racist premises, I suppose. I mean, the idea that you can study Asians as if they're a category, that has always been problematic, and was recognised by area studies specialists as problematic. It was something that was built into the foundations of area studies as fields of study, and that people within those fields of study grappled with constantly. But I think at the same time, what area studies at its best can do, what the learning of languages can do, what ethnographic research can do, is it can make room at the table for different perspectives. And I think that's where peace studies is really going now, and it's where, to some extent, critical international relations is really going, thinking about, local perspectives, different perspectives that are not the dominant perspective. And I think that that's something that we really need to rethink our ability, the methods that we're going to use. I'm talking about research methods. There's research methods that we're going to use. How do we take those methods? How do we develop language skills? How do we develop skills in ethnography? How do we develop listening skills? A number of people have said this during the course of the conference. How do we make room at the table for non-Western perspectives? That, for me, is a big challenge for peace studies. And for me, it's some peace studies, I think, has immense potential to offer those kinds of opportunities. I think that one of the other key areas for me in coming to Bradford, the way that I have always understood peace studies at Bradford during my academic career, and part of the sort of respect that I have for the Department of Peace Studies is, again, it's already been referred to, the normative commitment, the activist, sort of the radical tinge of peace studies at Bradford. Something that has always been there, which you can see if you go and look at our Commonweal collection. We've got the original design of the CND logo, which I think is absolutely fantastic thing to have. The kind of record that is here within the University of Bradford of radical activism for peace. Now, again, I think this is something that we've kind of forgotten how to do it. We don't know how to do it anymore. And again, this has been talked about a lot during the conference. I think David and Oliver both, to some extent, talked about this. We don't know how to be radical anymore because the old certainties of right versus left have gone. But I think I just would conclude by sort of echoing what Paul started with. In an era of climate change, I don't think we can afford to forget how to be activists. Perhaps activism needs to take a new approach. It certainly needs to take a more respectful approach. We can't assume that professors at Bradford are going to lead the masses to a progressive revolution. I don't know if that ever was the assumption, but we certainly can't assume that now. But in an era of climate change, we cannot afford the luxury of sitting in our offices critically theorising. We have to find out ways to get outside of the institution and to find out what's happening and to engage productively, engage through relationships of solidarity with people who are in trouble, people who are in conflict-affected areas, people who are in climate change-affected areas, people who I believe are looking for alliances with us. I don't quite buy this idea that whenever we go there, we're being imperialist. Maybe to some extent we are. Certainly there are relations of domination. Certainly there are power relations that anyone who's ever done field research has to be acutely aware of. But there are people looking for our help. And I think that we also will find that we need their help when climate change really starts to hit home. And that, for me, is the most important reason to try to make sure that peace studies remains an engaged and open-minded and an activist field of study. Thank you.
Great. We do have a few minutes left. I could ask people if they want to put any questions. If you do, that's fair enough. I'd much prefer people who might want to make comments or reflections on the last 2 or 3 days. Would you like to go first, please? We will use the roving mic again. A lot of people have stayed, which is great, but we need to keep the oral side going nicely.
Thank you. Mine's very quick. It's a thank you to you all. I am your visiting soldier, It's been a privilege to be that person here, and I have learnt a huge amount. I think the relationship between war studies, the military, and peace studies is absolutely critical. And I would appeal, please, if you want new targets, that's probably not the right word. Inviting some more military here to learn as I have this week would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I might say that we have got far more engagement in that area now. A number of us lecture in the defence colleges. One of our PhD students here is a half colonel in the Pakistani army. We do in-service courses for the Ministry of Defence. In fact, there's one running in a fortnight's time on European security. I think one over there, I think there was, wasn't there? Okay, take Owen next, but there was one or two others over here. Yes, Wendy. Owen first, then Wendy, and then we'll see how we're going.
Thanks. I was immediately stimulated by that, and as Paul says, I mean, I think one of the characteristics, and I think it is good, and I would stick up for it strongly, is the breadth of engagement that peace studies has tended to have, and also with a whole range of different groups. One of the objectives with the groups as they enter first year undergraduate and first year MA, as well as other things, is to disabuse anybody of any idea that there is a uniform, rather closed sense of what peace studies is about. And in that context, we recruit quite widely, but as Paul says, there's a very strong engagement with, we have short course on with the Ministry of Defence and so on, and across the world with UNDPKO and so on. So that's very important. My general point, which is a comment, but it's a welcome too, that I think this panel has demonstrated for me something that I think is very important to peace studies, and that's that alongside the thematic and sort of analytical approaches that were being debated in, picked up by the panel here, but debated particularly and raised in the earlier panel, our priorities are determined by world priorities about things that are happening, and in a sense, I've got a quite firm commitment. I would put it as multidisciplinarity, but the key is problem-focused. The priorities are fixed by a whole range of agendas and types of engagement. There's a style and what have you, but obviously then there's, but the key is, in a sense, is problem solving at a whole range of profound levels, not just technocratic problem solving. And I think that's very important. Obviously one of the challenges for us is that although we've grown greatly, we're still small scale to those challenges. And so, but I do think that it's, I think that that's something that has been a very important characteristic of peace studies at Bradford up to now. We've avoided some of the, to my mind, rather wasteful debates about quite what are the disciplinary parameters of peace studies and so on, and focus much more on what is important in terms of keeping up with contemporary debates. The challenge is that, of course, in order to be more effective, the more effective you are, the more focused you become in those contemporary debates if you're connecting with impact, and then how to maintain that breadth of critical engagement while at the same time learning lessons in very specific areas in order to be impactful. These are just comments, they're not, sure. People can respond, but as they don't.
Wendy, I think you were next, weren't you? Wendy from the Peace Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Okay, with a twist, right, fair enough.
Peace and conflict studies.
Sorry, yep.
Some kind of, what's it called? Accommodation to the realists, if you like. We're not just doing peace, yes. Anyway, so I'm the Deputy Director of that centre at the moment, and I wanted to say something just briefly for those who I haven't met during the conference about the fact that we celebrated last year our 25th anniversary of being a Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies in Australia, which is the only one that survived, and I might add thrived, in a lot of ways. In other ways, it's always facing struggles, and we're facing our own issues of threats of amalgamation, etc. You know, do we continue to remain as an independent centre, that kind of thing. So we've thrived in terms of academic programs of teaching and our research, I would say, and our practice, and particularly our activism. So as an integrated, interdisciplinary, multi-level, all of those things that you listed nicely at the beginning. So, you know, I just want to acknowledge that, I guess, as one thing as well, that there's 40 years of Bradford, there's 25 years here, and I'm sure there's others around the world. And the other side of that, that is actually a question, as well as a comment, is the institutionalised and professionalised aspect of anniversaries, which this year is the 50th anniversary of the International Peace Research Association's existence. And in August in Turkey is the 25th biennial conference. Now, I haven't heard that mentioned in any session anywhere at any time during this conference. And I also know who I have or haven't seen at different times at various IPRA conferences. And I haven't been there the whole time because I got disillusioned, and what's the point, and this isn't where it all happens anyway, we need to go to ISA or somewhere else instead. So there's all those issues. What my question is, how could this be another vehicle? What do you think? I am interested in what you think or what anybody thinks about the connection between the future of peace studies and the International Peace Research Association as being the I guess the founding and the critical sort of overall attempting to be the professional place for peace studies to have a what's the word? A position, I guess, globally.
An engagement in a sense.
Yes, a global academic position, I guess, as well as a practice position. Thank you.
Caroline or Jenny, do you want to make any comment on that? I have been to a number of IPRA conferences, I must admit candidly, not for the last decade or so. It is perhaps a fault. I believe we are going to try and get 1 or 2 people go to the one this year, but it's something we have not engaged with, and I must admit, and a number of the other sort of well-established peace centres haven't either. And I think it is a deficiency, frankly.
Why do you think not? Why?
I think there are 2 reasons. One practical, the other rather blunt. Practical because the centres have often been struggling a lot with their own identity and development. They've often been pretty insecure and have been very much focused on themselves. And I think the blunt one is they haven't been convinced that IPRA has been very effective, frankly. Now, of course, the problem is that's partly because they don't engage with it. And I think that's the issue. One towards the back here, please.
My comment is an appeal from a student perspective. So I'm really encouraging the peace academics and educators here to really put peace and justice at the center. You have the safety and the space to do that. And you also have a really important and unique position, educating the next generations. Over the last year that I've been here at the MA level in security studies, nonviolence, abolition of war, demilitarization, conversion, justice and accountability of the West, none of this has been incorporated into my studies at all. I think there's been too much timidity and too much of the status quo, and people are tired of militarism, they're tired of patriarchy, they're tired of war, and they want things to stop, and they want things to be different. And there's this amazing global movement outside our doors that's converging. I'm thinking about the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, their new campaign, Women Say No to War, and the World Beyond War movement that just started up. And 3 years ago, 1 Billion Rising, the campaign to stop violence against women, and the Global Day of Action against military spending, to reduce military spending, to invest instead in our urgent environmental and social needs. None of this has penetrated my studies this year. Don't take this as a criticism. Take this as a challenge to be bolder. There really needs to be a new Bradford approach, one that's more radical, participatory, and transformative. If Bradford University doesn't do it, no one will, but the world really needs it. Thank you.
Yeah. I think I have to say, I think many of us feel that criticism is very justified, and we have a lot to do. It goes back to, in fact, a point Tom was making about really rethinking the curriculum, which sounds very dry, but behind that should be something much more radical and progressive. We have quite a long way to go. But so I would certainly agree with that. Do we have any further? Peter, please.
Can I just say something on that? I mean, at the undergraduate level, we do courses on violence and non-violence, and there's a gender day. I mean, maybe this is something that the MA needs to look at. Yeah. But I would say at the undergraduate level, we are raising all the issues that you talk about.
Yeah. Peter?
Two possible suggestions. Paul has done and is doing a lot of media work nationally. I think we might need more people within the staff, but to do that work and to carry that on into the future. And the second thing, faiths and peace has never really been very much of the curriculum here, and I wonder whether that might be thought about a little more in the future, not least because it was a Quaker-based organisation that got the money together in the first place.
In relation, just briefly, to the second one, there was a possibility 2 or 3 years ago about trying to raise the money for a chair in religion and peace. There were a lot of internal issues in the university and it never came to anything. We do, of course, have Philip Lewis, who's long been with us as a part-time lecturer, who has contributed to that. But I think there's a very good chance as peace studies really develops, I think quite rapidly in the next 3 or 4 years, we may be able to revisit that. Because in fact, in practical terms, it's the kind of area where you can probably get specific endowment to do. But it's still a big gap. Please, I think one here.
Right, my name is Tawhidul Islam, and I'm an alumni in Bradford and a current student and a faculty back home in Bangladesh in peace and conflict studies. It's indeed a pleasure for me to be here. But one thing which I have seen from my master's days here, that is there any relationship with other institutions who work in many other corners in the world, especially in South Asia, in Africa and other aspects? Because it is important that still I think that the school is established, the Bradford School is established now, and we know that what are the philosophies we carry forward. We analyze the patterns of conflict, underlying causes, and all are bottom scale, but the people who are coming here from different aspects, they are all a privileged part. So what we can do on that to do something for that people on that ground, that would be a good idea to explore. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I would certainly accept that. In fact, we do have a lot of connections. I mean, David Francis has a huge range of connections across sub-Saharan Africa. I think in many ways Caroline's work as well, and Jenny's particularly Latin America. Also, of course, we do have the Rotary Centres. You know, we're one of 6 Rotary Centres, well established now. There's ourselves as Uppsala, there's a joint centre between University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Duke University. There's the International Christian University in Tokyo, there's Queensland, and there's the one at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. And in fact, Tom Woodhouse lectures are there regularly. And I think the Rotary scheme is a very good way of bringing people together. But again, we have to do much more. And the problem is that, in a sense, we have a responsibility, but there are only so many people here to do it. And I'm conscious of the fact that a number of the staff, I mean, I know people like Owen and Jenny in particular, but many others, do a huge amount of work with NGOs, which is completely in addition to their normal duties. So it's limited resources, but we are doing quite a lot. But I acknowledge we should be doing very much more. I think we just have, is there one more question? Yes, go on, make this the last one, if I may. David Curran.
Yeah, hi. I suppose I speak as somebody, this conference has been quite fantastic in a sense. I came here to do my undergraduate and I've sort of come quite a distance to being from that stage through an MPhil to a PhD, to being at the kind of other end of the scale as on the lecturing front. And seeing, and I've also just come back from a short sort of field visit, in a sense, to the United Nations headquarters, where what I've seen there, and linking it to the relevance of some of what, you know, we speak about radical ideas, is that the infrastructures for peace that are in existence and have taken many of the concepts that we've spoken about, yes, they exist, but they're far from perfect in how they run and how they work. And we speak about the challenges that are there. One of the things I found out, and it didn't take long to find it out, is how ill-prepared some of these organisations and this architecture is to deal with the future in a very strange way. It's a very archaic system in many aspects, with diplomats with a very sort of narrow view on exactly what can be done and what should be done, and national capitals not really offering any more help as opposed to what is in their national interest. So I think what, for me, coming into this is that, you know, the ideas that peace studies as an academic endeavour with policy, implications, these radical ideas actually have, can still make quite a fundamental change, even though we see that the world has come so far. It's definitely not come far enough, and the way people think in these places it certainly still needs to be challenged and pushed forward. It's more a comment than anything. So,
thank you very much, David. That, I'm afraid, has to be the last comment. As one of the oldest lags, possibly the oldest lag, it's my privilege to bring the conference to an end. The fact there are so many people here at 5:20 on a Saturday afternoon indicates the huge interest in the subject. There are many people to thank, and I'd like to go through the list. I actually start off with Jenny, whose original idea it was to have a conference, and you suggested the title, Why War? But there are many others. I mean, the participants, all of the people who've come from more than 20 countries, the keynote speakers, the people who presented papers. On the funding side, Quaker Peace Studies Trust has been absolutely crucial, and Peter and the trustees have been immensely helpful. It's been very nice to see a number of them present here. This department would never have existed without the Quakers, and they supported us so much over many years. It is massively welcome. The School of Social and International Studies has put funding in. The John and Elnora Ferguson African Studies Centre has also put funding in. Thanks to all of those. Thanks very much to the Peace Studies staff, David in particular, and also Fiona McCauley, who you saw this afternoon, who is organising Peace Jam today. That's been hugely helpful, and the steering committee, obviously. The conference team themselves, Anastasia, Linda, Maria in particular, and Paul doing the technical side, and all of the many student ambassadors and supporters. It's really been brilliant the way people have always been on hand to help us find our way, navigate through this rather unusual campus. I'd also think the media studies people, the students there who have actually been helping us with the media stuff, that too has been very valuable. And the exhibition organisers is Alison Cunningford from the library, Peter van den Dungen, and Peter Nias again. And talking of Peter van den Dungen, it's been great to see Peter, Sarah Perigo and Tom Woodhouse, who've survived 40 years, almost 40 years of peace studies, and they're still breathing. It's quite extraordinary. It must be 30 years since we held a general peace studies conference here. It won't be another 30 years. In fact, I rather suspect it will not be, it'll be before the 50th anniversary. Because one idea that actually came up today, and I daren't suggest it with Caroline here, is that 2 years' time is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Adam Curl. And one possibility might be to run a conference on that theme, which I think, as John Paul was saying, and as Tom was saying, it really would be very good. And one of the things we will do soon is to reprint Adams and James's inaugural lectures. They are brilliant, and they were called together Peace with Work to Do. It's out of print, but it won't be for very much longer. I'll make sure, and David will make sure that happens. Let me leave you with just a couple of thoughts. My definition of prophecy is suggesting the possible. Suggesting the possible. I think given the challenges we face, the aim particularly of peace researchers and peace students is always to be able to do that. But the final thought, in fact, a few years ago, I was giving evidence at one of the parliamentary select committees, and on the same group giving evidence, it was on, I think, a nuclear issue, was Mike Maguire. Now, I don't know how many of you know or remember Mike. He was an astonishing person, naval officer, naval attaché in Moscow, and then the best of the independently minded Kremlinologists of the late Cold War period. And I remember him leaning across to me and saying, you know, on occasions like this, Paul, the trick has to be to have the ability to say the outrageous acceptably. And I think if we take that as a motto for peace studies for the next 10 years, we won't go far wrong. Thank you very much indeed. But before you go, there is one more person to thank, and I wanted to keep that separate, and that is Caroline herself, who's actually put together this conference and been the guiding force, particularly in the last 2 months. So can we end with applause, particularly for Caroline?